Garland Nixon joins us from Washington, D.C. to talk about America, yes, but to talk about how the world is changing. Garland, welcome back to the show. Always a pleasure to have you on. Let's start, though, with this Silicon Valley Bank. I made the point that when a butterfly flutters its wings in Silicon Valley in California, then a hurricane can be expected across your country and across the world. Any insight into how Washington is going to attempt to tackle what might be as bad as 2008 all over again?
Well, I will say this, that sadly, Joe Biden probably does have a little bit of a relief there because his Nord Stream hoax started to fall apart. I don't know if you were following that, but Reuters, after the claim that there was 6 guys on a sailboat who bombed the Nord Stream pipeline, Reuters adjusted that. Apparently, they've added additional boat, and I imagine that as the story comes unglued even more, they'll continue to add boats until they have an entire flotilla of sailboats that made their way out into the Baltic Sea and blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. So there's maybe some relief from the Biden administration that they don't have to face that disaster that they've created for themselves. But I mean, to be quite frank, people are holding their breath to just show how broad the implications are. I'm just an average, regular old person here in America. I didn't think in any way, shape, or form connected to the SVB Bank. I had what I would consider a moderate amount of money that I was attempting to move in crypto yesterday, and I found out that this had affected the crypto market in a way that my money that I had was frozen. It's not my life savings by any stretch of the imagination, but just to show that, how many people are affected, a person who had never even really heard of SVB Bank until now. It's had dramatic effects on the crypto market, and people are holding their breath. There are a lot of people that I've talked to that said they are considering going to the bank tomorrow to move their money to a credit union or a small bank that's more stable, which would, of course, mean, 1929 in this day and age. I think this also demonstrates the damage that was done by deindustrialization, because as the United States was deindustrialized, it was financialized. And now all of the economic power is made through these complicated financial instruments, which means that when the economy starts to fall, there is no industrial base to back it up. There's no jobs for people to go to and make things anymore. All of this money is created through strange and financial instruments. And as SVB falls apart, figuring out what caused it to fall apart will be as difficult as fixing it.
95% of its customers had more than $250,000 in the bank, so its liquidation has cost a very significant number of people a very great deal of money. Some of them individuals, many of them companies, startup companies, one must presume, and they will now be laying off workers or having to close their doors altogether. And that's just the first ripple of those directly affected. You mentioned 1929 when bankers and stockbrokers were leaping off tall buildings and the Wall Street crash then catapulted the rest of us into the Great Depression of the 1930s, the tent cities and the dust bowls and all of Steinbeck's wonderful descriptions of what happened. And this is all, as Professor Wolf was saying, not just entirely predictable, but entirely predicted, because it is intrinsic in the fundamental dichotomy in the economic system we have, that people do things for private profit, while the public, which will be required presumably to try and bail out the consequences of the rapacious pursuit of profit by a few, will themselves be beggared either by the bailout, if there is to be one, or by the consequences of no bailout, if there isn't to be one.
So what we're looking at is a couple of things, and that is, this is not a new scenario. If we look at 1990 and 2000, every 8 to 10 years for quite some time now, we've had an economic downturn. Generally, there would be, some manner of job loss and economic loss. But as neoliberalism entrenched itself more deeply into our system, the last couple, 2008 and potentially now, have been dramatically more severe. And I think we're just looking at now a situation where 2008 was never addressed and could not be addressed because it was systemic. They simply put some patches on what was going on and allowed it to expand. And now we have the Biden administration, which is simply a neocon administration. They're inept enough at their foreign policy, but they have nothing when it comes to domestic policy. You can see, the perfect symbolic issue here was East Palestine. You could not write a movie. You couldn't write a book for a worse response than the Biden administration and Pete Buttigieg. It was a caricature of government. So looking at the way they handled that particular issue, you certainly know that this financial disaster in the hands of these incompetent people will be magnified rather than mitigated. So I think there is a combination of a fear that the system has dropped to a level where the hoax is up, the game is up. This the game of three-card Molly and hiding the money that they had is about to fall apart. And you accompany that with the Biden administration, Joe Biden, I mean, he can barely find his way off of a stage anymore without either a service dog or, someone to help him, to guide him to an exit. And there's certainly no hope that this guy and the crew that he's put together is going to be able to do anything other than make it worse.
Now, you mentioned foreign policy, Garland, as did Professor Wolf earlier. Let's take a couple of truly outstanding examples of how things are falling apart for the U.S. The sight of Saudi Arabia and Iran kissing and making up, not in Camp David or on the White House lawn, but in Beijing, under the hammer and sickle of the Chinese People's Republic. If that doesn't show the extent to which the tectonic plates have shifted, I don't know what would.
Yes, and it demonstrates something very profound, and that is the U.S. empire operates by creating chaos and instability in a region. If you look at the actions that we've taken over the last 20 years, invading countries, overthrowing government, meddling in the affairs of countries, everywhere, but particularly here for the purposes of this discussion, the Middle East, we've created instability intentionally. Even now, the United States over the last several months the last several weeks particularly, has worked to prohibit countries from being able to assist Syria in rebuilding and continue to occupy 1/3 of Syria and to steal their resources. So China has come in and they first, now keep in mind, a few weeks ago, they released a document in which they carefully argued all of they made a powerful argument against U.S. hegemony, and they brought in the president of Iran, met with the leadership of China. Afterwards, they have taken an act that has worked to bring stability to the Middle East. And if anyone looks at a map and they see how Saudi Arabia gets their oil to the sea, they'll see they can use the Persian Gulf, which is controlled at the Straits of Hormuz by Iran, or they can use I believe it's the Red Sea, which is controlled by, ostensibly, if Yemen has control of their country, by Yemen, which is an ally of Iran, and of course they can go out the Suez Canal. So Saudi Arabia greatly benefits from this because now they're guaranteed that no one's going to close down their access to the sea. They win, Iran wins, everybody wins. It isolates Israel, which will, of course, magnify the internal contradictions in Israel and make it more difficult for Israel to strike out at other countries. Israel is going to have to deal with its internal contradictions as the chaos around it begins to be mitigated. And keep an eye on Turkey. You know, we could talk a long time. This is going to have a dramatic effect on Turkey.
The there are two others actually I'd like to ask you about, but one of them less significant. It's this one. The United States moved all of its assets, its metaphorical tanks, onto the lawn of the parliament and government of Georgia, the former Soviet Republic, in a mass protest against a law which would force organizations to divulge the extent of their foreign funding. A law which both the United States and Canada themselves have. Indeed, you are hunted as a foreign agent in the United States if you even do the racing column in a Russian newspaper. Georgia was going to require people to declare that X% of their budget came from the United States, and they moved heaven and earth to have the law destroyed. And they might not have given up. Maybe regime change in Georgia is on the... Does that not brazenly show the hypocrisy and double standards to... I mean, a blind man could see that.
And keep in mind that this is not new. The United States has taken the same position with Nicaragua. The Ortega government in Nicaragua took the same action in creating essentially a Foreign Agent Registration Act law and eventually arrested people who refused to go along with that law. And the United States, of course, denounced them and extensively sanctioned Nicaragua for doing exactly what the United States does. And what we're seeing, and I think this is an example for countries such as Saudi Arabia, for countries who now are being put in a position where they, as Kamala Harris has, basically said to the global South, you have to be with us or against us, that they have to, quote, make a decision. I think they're looking at the hypocrisy here on the outside. They can see it. And the United States may even be able to get away with it in the short run. But the countries on the outside who are looking in are now saying, this dishonesty, this hypocrisy and contradictory behavior that says, you want a feudalistic system where, you can be the nobility and we all have to be peasants isn't going to work for us. This is what I believe is causing countries in Africa to protest and wave Russian flags. This is what's causing countries in the Middle East to look to the Eurasian coalition of countries and say, we want people that at least when we make a deal and shake hands with them, that they'll agree not to meddle in our internal interests. They'll agree not to sanction us outside of the UN rules and regulations, and we won't have to deal with these types of hypocritical contradictions. So even when the U.S. gets away with it, the rest of the world is watching at a time when the U.S. is forcing the world into an even more distinct multipolar system than would be organically forming on its own.
As you bring up Africa, Blinken is headed for Ethiopia, where he will land in an airport built by China. He'll be received in administrative buildings that were built by China. He'll drive to the capital, Addis Ababa, along a highway that was built by China. What can Blinken offer the Ethiopians that can compete with that?
Blinken can offer nothing. And in fact, the Ethiopians and the rest of the world, I'm sure, are looking at the SVB bank system. And they're saying, we're looking at China's economic system. We're looking at Russia's economic system. You tried to sanction them out of out of business, and they're still going strong. They're, again, my father used to have a saying, children don't listen, they watch and learn. And I would argue that the same thing for these nations. They're watching and they're saying, yes, you have the power and authority right now to get away with a lot. But if you want us to join you in a coalition, we're going to watch you. And they're looking at the U.S. system and they're seeing it in collapse in every way, shape, or form. They're looking at China, and the two words, when you think of diplomacy, the two words that you cannot associate with the U.S., which I think are the most important words to associate with diplomats, are stability and justice. A just system where everyone is treated the same, and stability where the acts of diplomacy creates greater stability in a region or in a country. They're looking at the U.S. Bombing of the Nord Stream 2, and if it wasn't bad enough, they're coming up with literally a childish hoax to argue that's just collapsed before they could even barely get it out of their mouths. They're trapped in this childish hoax that they came up with afterwards. The rest of the countries see this, and they're saying China and Russia seem more stable. They seem more economically stable. Their governments step in when they need to take stabilizing actions within their economy. The United States has this magical economy that says all we have to do is allow companies to make maximum profit and somehow it'll work out. And the countries are seeing that neoliberalism only works to funnel money to a very tiny number of oligarchs at the top. And so people are moving in the direction of stability. They're moving in the direction of justice and non-interference. And Tony Blinken is just going there. I mean, his history is he carried Joe Biden's coat and umbrella for 20 years, and that's how he was rewarded with his job. He has no history of being a diplomat, and clearly he has no clue how to be a diplomat. China, am I saying this? China made it clear if they were to call Tony Blinken and comment on the Middle East, they'd say, this is what happens when you send a boy to do a man's job.
Yes. Finally, Garland, it's red carpet time. The Oscars. Was it a sign, a straw in the wind, that Zelensky asked to come to the Oscars and the Oscars knocked it back?
Absolutely. It seems that as though, people are seeing the handwriting on the wall. And particularly if you think about Hollywood, they can quickly turn their back on someone. No one can cancel you quicker than Hollywood. They're looking at Zelensky and they're understanding that things are not going in his direction. And I would argue that the SVB, this particular financial issue, is going to make it a lot harder to get the next $25 billion or whatever they want to hand over to Ukraine. And not only that, it's going to make it harder for him to continue to invest in crypto scams, which is they've been pretty good at doing. I think Hollywood sees the writing on the wall and they are distancing themselves from someone who they probably understand may soon be out of power in one shape or another.